Here we go, 4Ps, episode 139, and it feels like it's been a month since the last 4Ps, and I promise it's only been a week. It's only the second week of 2021. But given what's happened since, no one's going to blame you if you're feeling some sort of relative time distortion.
The 4Ps. Professional. Political. Practical. Personal.
Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff flipped the Senate last Tuesday. The President of the United States incited an armed insurrection at the Capitol building, and his supporters murdered a police officer on Wednesday. The New York Mets pulled off their biggest trade in 20 years on Thursday, and we had the 5 worst days in history for COVID deaths in the United States. Finally, the digital publishing and marketing platforms, they're really media platforms, they finally woke up and did something positive to curtail hate speech and violence. Now, those things may not have been listed in order of importance or impact, obviously, but a key theme for this week, insightful over insightful. We're starting with something political this week. And if you're a reader or a viewer or a listener of the 4Ps content, and you have been for any period of time, you know my position on the catastrophic impact that Donald Trump's failed presidency has had on our nation. And while I imagine something like the events of last week's Trump-led attack on the Capitol building, I never actually thought it would happen to the extent that it did. The violence is sickening, but the threat that it posed to American democracy cannot and should not be underrated. Nor can we allow the spin and the distractions that have taken place since last Wednesday to let conspirators and criminals off the hook. Fortunately, the social media platforms that were used to thicken plots and coordinate plans and proliferate this pandemic of hate, they're finally banning Trump and others for committing crimes while using their channels. And yes, inciting insurrection is a crime. America's most prevalent and biggest business leaders are finally stepping up too. Some far later than others, but we're seeing many CEOs and business associations condemning last week's events, as they should. Some businesses even call for President Trump's removal. Ben & Jerry's has always been a company of heroes, and it's why they've been a staple in our freezer for 2 decades. But the biggest thing that corporations can do to improve both their bottom line and our society as a whole is to stop corporate campaign contributions to elected officials who've undermined democracy. So kudos to Marriott for being the first this week. There's an article in the Harvard Business Review that calls on all business leaders to move on from the assumption that someone else is going to ensure democracy. That the seeds of progress were planted last year in the wake of social justice protests after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor last spring. Now, faced with a pandemic and racial injustice and electoral mayhem, companies ventured into previously unseen territories in 2020 and lent their influence, really, and their money, in some cases, to just helping solve these issues. And that's continued now into 2021, as many brands have even pulled back on marketing last week. But they shouldn't have had to if they were aligned with being a force for good all along. As Professor Scott Galloway said this week, criminality should be prevented and punished by all viable means, whether public or private. And that justice has to be swift and harsh. It has to send a message to limit what could be an even more violent next week, a run-up into the inauguration in Washington on the 20th. This is not over. Trump has been deplatformed, but can we expect him or his cult to accept that their soft coup failed? The American democracy was tested last week, but that test is far from over. If Congress doesn't take appropriate action for a president helping to incite a violent riot inside the Capitol, which led to the deaths, many deaths, and threatened the safety of Congress, then our system and our people are failing. Something practical. And in last week's 4Ps, I talked about the first steps toward accepting imperfection. And one of the areas addressed was understanding how to identify one's flaws and then bolster them. But not all flaws need to be fixed. They're part of who we are, and without them, we lose authenticity and the ability to connect with others. Instead of feeling lesser because of shortcomings, we can see them as opportunities for continued growth. Most people's instincts are to hide their flaws, and that's rooted in our sensitivity to feedback and criticism. Maybe it's our Neanderthal DNA and fear of being ostracized from those early initial social circles and being cast out into the wilderness. But we're so attuned to negative feedback that we actually anticipate it. But we've come a long way as intelligent Homo sapiens. Accepting and embracing flaws means viewing your thoughts and actions and even failures from a place of understanding, not judgment. Getting to self-acceptance doesn't require excessive use of controlled substances or some hippie mindfulness guru. It's just about being aware of and forgiving of and curious about and ultimately accountable for our own issues. It's about taking responsibility for the negative ways that we respond to the world. For me, this starts with recognizing and understanding my triggers. We all have them. Content triggers, it's information or ideas that we find unhelpful or unfair or we just simply disagree with. There are lots of those going around these days, right? Then there's relationship triggers about the who is sharing that information and what is their background and what, if any, negative feelings might we have about them. Believe it or not, just thinking about this has allowed me to stay calmer and less likely to engage the trolls on Twitter and even ignore the first ever hate mail that I got last week in response to the 4Ps. And no, to that person, I will not unsubscribe you for you. You do it yourself. There's a link. Just fucking undo it. And thanks for the invitation to go fuck myself. Finally, identity triggers are ideas that you have about yourself or that others may have that totally clash with your sense of self. Just take deep breaths. The natural human reaction is that we tend to push back against any perspectives that don't align with our own. This behavior, though, can be harmful. Different perspectives are opportunities for learning and growth beyond the tint of our own assumptions, even when you know they're wrong, right? Whether it's extreme terrorists with their 6MWE t-shirts, it means being completely present when you receive information and withholding judgment until you've actually had the time to understand it. Another example, if you don't hear back from a client after sending an email for a day or two, don't assume they're unhappy with you or that you're about to be fired. By giving yourself a chance to totally understand information, you open yourself up to the growth and learning that a variety of perspectives can offer. Transformation, it's not a destination or a single aha moment. It's more like an evolution, one we encourage by acting on and learning from those triggers. So I'm here in my bedroom where the magic happens. And by magic, I mean sleep magic. See why people sleep better with Casper. From mattresses and pillows to linens and more, Casper has studied and mastered the science of sleep. If you're interested, go to Casper.com to learn more. Or just shoot me an email and I'll send you a link for 15% off an order that includes a Casper mattress. Something personal. And I think it's fair to say that I'm somewhat of a germaphobe. Well, it might not just be a phobia. It's probably more, well, it's more than an awareness and an aversion, but less than a phobia. And this was not brought on by COVID. This has been going on for, 15 plus years, most likely thanks to a 15 plus year relationship with my wife, who is a physician. But it's manifested itself in a number of ways over the years, from excessive hand washing and Purell, again, way before COVID, to simple things like not letting people wear shoes in our house. Yes, I'm totally fine, though, with our dog sleeping in our bed. An animal who walks on the sidewalk in the backyard, who sniffs other dogs' droppings and licks the floor and will eat our kids' snotty tissues if they leave them on the nightstand. Yes, we let him sleep in our bed. So the question is, what's crazier, that I allow this, that I have just thought about why this is totally inconsistent with all of my other rules and behaviors, or why I've dedicated valuable real estate here on the 4Ps to this conundrum? So I'd love to hear from you. If you have a dog, do you let it sleep in your bed? Are there rules that you have as to when they can sleep in your bed? hit me up on Twitter. Would love to hear. And finally this week, something professional. And for many of us, we've now gone over 300 plus days since COVID forced us to work remotely. Many have adapted quickly and have seen increases in productivity and engagement. Others have struggled, but most fall somewhere in between. And it obviously ebbs and flows. Of course, nobody romanticizes a rush hour stuck on the train or stuck in traffic on the highway. No one thinks of the stress of taking an entire day off of work because the cable guy was supposed to come between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., but didn't call until 10 minutes before. No one thinks about having to choose between living in your dream city, where you've always wanted to live, or moving to somewhere drab and alienating because that's where the jobs in your industry happen to be. All too often, office work acts as an obstacle rather than an asset to achieving our dream careers. According to a survey from a couple years ago, it was pre-COVID, by job search site FlexJobs, 76% of respondents said that they'd be more productive working remotely because of fewer interruptions from colleagues. But the same survey also showed that employees who stayed home worked the equivalent of one additional day per week. Remote employees work during their non-existent commute time. Their breaks and lunches and meals are shorter and less frequent. And they take far fewer vacation days and sick days, which isn't good. As the COVID vaccine deployment process begins, somewhat disorganized, but is beginning, a lot of us are starting to think about returning to offices again at some point this year, right? Leaders and managers are realizing that offering a flexible remote option long term can translate into loyalty and reduce costs. Organizations that refuse to offer their employees this possibility, or at least an option for partial remote work, are just going to be less competitiveness. They jeopardize their ability to recruit the best people long term. And we know that the cost of hiring a brand new employee usually far exceeds the expenses involved in keeping a current one. Ultimately, focusing on results rather than time spent can help ease productivity concerns with remote employees. The marketing industry, for example, right? Agencies, certainly, we thrive, or we think we do, in person because creatives need to collaborate together. Collaboration is typically better in person, maybe, but if we change our company's goals and mindset from time-oriented to results-oriented, we're going to more than offset the lack of in-person time. By centering our collaborations around achievable concrete goals, even if the work is done at somewhat staggered times and the time together might be less, it's going to be more efficient. Right? But it also enables us to prioritize tasks better and then delegate them accordingly. And it fosters trust and transparency, not only between managers and employees, but also among coworkers. Transitioning to working from home has always been suggested as something that you ease into and gradually learn as a process. We didn't have that luxury, though, last March. So we also have to realize that not every employee is equipped for success currently in remote working environments, whether it's because of time management skills or communication skills or work ethic, or even just a weaker technological foundation where you don't understand how to connect all the different monitors and Bluetooth keyboard to your laptop. But there are some things that we can do. One is establish routines. Not doing so can actually lead to overworking. It can also lead to extra distractions. Multitaskers actually do worse than those able to focus solely on the task at hand. So turn off unnecessary email and phone notifications and know at what time you're most alert and engaged, and same goes for those that you're working most closely with. Also, use collaboration tools. There are some great ones, and we're all learning how to navigate those even more and even better now. And be as clear as possible in your emails or in those Slack channels, right? Make each point or question very obvious with numbers or bullet points. Break it up so it doesn't just look like a long paragraph that people are going to get lost in. You can have more check-ins, even if they're less formal. And as corny as it's been in my own personal experience, connecting new hires that have never met anyone in real life with a buddy at the company who's either at their level or with similar circumstances, right? A peer, not a manager. That can be really helpful with onboarding, with culture, with stability, and long-term loyalty. Thank you for your long-term loyalty, and talk again next week.